Episode 5? Episode 5.
5.
Go us.
Go us. That's right.
The Empire Strikes Back?
Hmm?
Isn't that The Empire Strikes Back?
That's something like that.
Sure.
But we are going to cover thrusts strike back tonight. That is our primary goal. Is we're going to be talking about thrusting with cut-oriented weapons and kind of what the difference is in prime approaches to this idea when you're dealing with some of the heavier blades and not dealing with rapiers. That's kind of sort of one of the key elements to this, right?
Right. So we've looked at various weapons and their cut speed versus
Distance.
Yeah. And we've talked about what happens when you flip the paradigm. So longswords are generally slow and shoulder very powerful, and we showed you last time what happens when you do wrist cuts and they're very fast. And we showed you very slow with a rapier, which is typically pretty fast.
We showed you big cuts with rapiers and small cuts with longswords and how to sort of manage the speed between either. But principally what we've been covering the last few weeks is why cutting is a good idea,
right,
and when cutting is a good idea.
Right.
And tonight what we're going to do is
remind you that cut and thrust has thrusting.
That's right. But you might want to approach it differently than you would if you were using rapier primarily, say. So we've got a lot of different we've got a lot of different weapons out tonight.
Not a rapier.
And a lot of them are heavier weapons. The traditionally slower weapons, the more cut-oriented weapons.
Right.
And we're gonna look at kind of how they work, because it's a little different than sort of the long lunging process that we're used to. A lot of what we're used to with rapier is sort of lunge in and try to get back and get out of measure,
right,
before you get hit. And there's even when you're doing some of the more maybe historically oriented closure and leverage oriented fencing, you're still using that lunge mechanic or that forward direct mechanic. You're using what we call the cone of defense.
Right. I would say that probably 90% of the time when you are thrusting, it's almost always with a lunge.
Right, or like a big step or
big
something
step.
like that, right?
Yeah, you're closing distance and you're extending your arm and sending the blade out into your opponent.
Yeah, and you're using like a wedge.
Right.
In many cases to defend yourself. You're using kind of that cone we talked about. The Italians call it the cone of defense. Spaniards use it.
Right. It's all circular.
It's very circular
windy.
oriented, and that's basically what we train for the most part when we train with rapiers. And we've seen a lot of people kind of come into cut and thrust,
right,
and deal with the heavier blades, and they're still trying to sort of use that as their base mechanic.
But they can't.
It doesn't work the same way when you're using like an arming sword or a dusack or
even longswords,
or especially longswords.
Right.
You end up fighting in this poking fashion, and you're not utilizing your blade and your body to its
full potential.
Full potential. Yeah.
So we can thrust with these heavier weapons, but almost all of the masters that we're going to look at tonight and the forms that we're going to look at tonight, they don't thrust with a lunge. There's almost no lunging involved in this at all,
right?
Which is great for me.
Certainly not in the way that we typically think about a lunge. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at this non-lunging closing of distance, but it requires us to learn a couple of new paradigms. We're not going to be using the standard back and forth footwork, and we won't be using the circular cone for defense. So we're going to be using the box.
Yeah, we're gonna we talked about this actually a little bit a few weeks ago. I think it was a couple episodes ago.
Yeah.
But it ended up not making the cut for the recordings because it was kind of it kind of skewed into territory where we're going to be covering it tonight. But it was answering a question about, well, why wouldn't you parry that cut in fourth, kind of a thing. And we started talking about kind of the differences between, or why are we covering an ox and not
Right.
fourth, right? That type of thing, and why it was important to use that type of leverage mechanic against a cut.
Right.
And so what you end up with is, instead of what we traditionally think of in Italian rapier as the cone of defense, where you have first,
Right.
second, third, fourth, and you're pushing this cone forwards, or you have with the Spaniards nails out, right? Nails down, nails in, nails up, and you're using essentially the same type of cone.
Right.
And it's that
Even when it's simple, like fingernails up and fingernails down, it's still circular.
It's
still,
that wedge, that very narrow wedge. We start looking at, well, we're pairing an ox, right? We're pairing in the slice, or we're pairing in the window guard if it's Italian, or we're doing something where we're lifting the sword and moving it into quadrants along kind of our large diagram that is a box. It's not necessarily a cone anymore. It's much more of a square shape that is where our defensive positions fall into.
Right, but that's primarily due to the weapons.
Right.
Rapiers are thin and they're light and they're long.
Right.
And there's a lot of distance between you and your opponent. These weapons that we're using that are primarily cut weapons are shorter usually, and thicker blades, heavier. They move slow, and the defense is different.
Yeah. So let's look a little bit at kind of how that, let's sort of prep the box for everybody, so we kind of have an understanding of what
That's
we're
the
doing
box.
and talking about. Let's. You want to start with dusacks tonight?
Sure.
We'll
let's-
look at the box using dusacks. That's always
Dusacks
fun.
are my favorite.
Dusacks are your favorite.
Dusacks and longswords, those are my favorite.
Yeah, and the box fits really well. In fact, we can do this with both dusacks and longswords too,
Right.
to show kind of how this box works.
Are we going to talk about the box positions?
Sure, go ahead.
So, as Lot said, if we look at our chart here, this chart is a cutting diagram, but it's very, it's a rectangle. So we have our high guards in H and B, and we have our low guards in F and D. And basically we're protecting our shoulders and we're protecting our about waistline. Would you say
Yeah,
waist-ish?
I mean, primarily you want to protect your waistline because, for the most part, and this is sort of historical context,
Right.
and technique from different forms. When we looked at a lot of these forms, and we've talked about this before, is we're not sticking our feet out in front of us. So there isn't a lot of leg defense so much as, if I'm using my sword as defense, I want to limit everything that's coming at me. So by keeping my legs withdrawn and using just a little bit of a forward lean, I can force the fight out in front.
Right.
And I'm no longer having to defend my leg from a cut, because anything you do that's going to try to hit my leg requires that you reach down to get it. And if I'm here,
This is bad for me.
there's really no target for you anywhere underneath my chest. So when I'm looking at defensive positions, I'm looking at positions that can defend everything that's coming in high, and then stuff that's coming up into my chest from below. And so the height of that is going to be primarily at my chest. Now I might bring my sword down into a low guard, but this is a position to cut from that we looked at. This is a charged position, not a defensive position.
Right.
Whereas when I'm using my defensive position, we talked a lot about kind of this ox position on high, and we've looked at a little bit of the plow or the slice positions down in the low line, and essentially I end up making this box. And this is
Right.
different from the rapier cone that I might make here. And what that does for me is, when
Do you want to show them the column? Oh, go ahead.
well, when you come to attack, if my opponent's going to be throwing a large, powerful cut, let's say from on high, and I'm trying to defend that with a cone, right? And I know we don't necessarily have it. So as you come
We're gonna
at
go
me,
nice and slow here.
we'll go nice and slow. As you come at me and I try to defend that with that cone, it's going to come through that leverage unless I get way out here and stop you before your momentum comes in. But if I block that here, your in charge of that. And so in order to change that, if I turn my edge up against that into that diagonal angle that she's cutting at, now I gain a lot more leverage. And I put myself in a position where my point is on line, which is what I want. And so this is required by the nature of the cut.
Right.
Versus if we're in thrust-oriented positions and you thrust at me, even with good leverage, I can turn a much more narrow defense and push you offline. But when that cut is coming in, it comes in with force and momentum, and it requires me to make a much wider action with my blade in order to defend against it and stay safe.
Right, and so that's where we end up with this box notion that I'm defending this line, you know, I'm defending here, I can even defend from here. And so, or even from straight parry or long point.
Right.
And, you know, so I've got the 4 points that I'm essentially defending with the various guards that we have available to us.
Right. And in some other forms, you might even see the addition of like, and even with dusack, you see a horizontal
Yep.
parry. There's horizontal blocking with the hand one side or the other, because again, when that blow is coming in for the head and you're not sure what the angle it's coming, I want to cover everything and make sure I'm safe before I do anything else. So this can be, you see this in saber technique, you
Yep.
see it in dusack technique. You know, we have lots of different variants of this.
Sometimes in longsword.
Sometimes in longsword, you can use your whole cross guard
Right.
to defend yourself in the same fashion. But the idea is I'm covering a lot more territory, whereas if I were just using a rapier, I wouldn't do any of that because the threat of the point is so much greater.
Right.
That I need to keep everything much more narrow.
Right, narrow, and it's fast moving. If you start making bigger actions with the rapier, it's easier for your opponent to go around it. It's easier for them to change the line and come in on you. With these weapons, if you try and play that tight and narrow game, because they're designed to be cutting weapons, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's much more. Yeah, you're losing out, and you have to force yourself into a lot of other predicaments.
Right.
I mean, those. Did you want to show that with the longsword too?
Sure.
Right. I mean, even I'll just use my shoulder.
Okay. You got it?
Yeah. So I mean, the same idea is when we're using a lot of these longsword positions, and once we've come out from, you know, our charge blow, and once we get out into that position, is I'm going to be defending in the same thing. So I've got my ox positions, and even my plow, which an earlier style plow or later style plow. You know, Fiore has these positions, and he's got the window guard and all of these things. We see these are the more common defense positions. We see a lot less of. We see playing and binding, which we'll get into,
Right.
but we see a lot less of that connular position that most people used to. So I see people get out there with longswords, and all they know how to do is push out,
play
and
tag.
they're not using, again, you know, you come in with a high cut. So she comes in with a really good cut at my head, and she's going to take my sword out of the way, and I try to parry that, and it's no good for me.
He's
Because
already
this type of parry just isn't going to work, and I have to lift that sword and use my box. And now I'm in a really good position here,
Yeah.
because I've taken her sword, I've defended my head, and I've put my point back online, right?
But again, we had to change from the circular defense that you typically see with rapier to the box defense
Right, yeah,
that you
that's
see
kind of
with
the
these
concept that
heavier
we're-
weapons.
So this is one of the things we're going to be. Sorry, this is one of the things we're going to be talking a lot about tonight,
Right.
or not necessarily talking about, but using this mechanic because of these reasons. Yeah.
Right. But we can't just do the box alone. So the box has to go with footwork. That is different than what we typically see with rapier. With rapier, a lot of the motion that we see with our opponent is a back and forth sort of motion, or lateral, again, these lunges. And it tends to be very linear. Spanish starts to break out of that mold where they have the concept of the circle and the advantage of the right angle. And that is where we're going to be heading with the footwork that we're going to talk about now for these heavier weapons and the box defense.
Yeah.
Because if I go straight in, as I'm doing the box defense, and we'll demonstrate this in a little bit, if I go straight in, I haven't changed the line and I've left myself wide open for attack. And so one of the things that we have to modify when we're using these weapons is we have to add compass stepping, we have to add circular motion, and angle steps. So if you imagine that there's a big circle with you and your opponent, and if you stick both your hands out, you know, we talked about honest measure in the first episode. We talked about honest measure in the first episode where you and your opponent are at the distance where if you just reach out and move forward, you're going to touch and you're going to kill each other. And so this is honest measure, and by the circle, I'm going to go that way, you want to go that way. With the circle, you know, if I step this way, my opponent's also going to step in that circular fashion. And if I change the line this way, they're also going to move. Now, if for some reason they move in an opposite direction from the direction that I'm moving, where they essentially go in the same circle path, I go this way and they go this way.
Yeah, you want me to go that way?
Yeah, I want you to go that way. So if I go this way, now I've closed distance. And they've closed distance. And so now we're too close together. But when we're dealing with these heavier weapons and the cone defense, these circular steps and angled steps allow us to take shorter movements, which can be deceptively fast. They allow us to get close to our opponent, change the line. So if my opponent is lunging, they're going to go that way. And I'm over here, and they're already dead. Because I've changed the line and I've closed distance, but I haven't had to move. I haven't had to take a giant step. I'm not rushing straight at them. So I'm making use of, think of them as invisible 45-degree lines on the floor. I'm taking advantage of horizontal lines. So it's very reasonable for me to just take a side step to the left. Because if they're still going straight, they are now going to go past me. If I'm reset and I take a step to the right, they're still going past me. In the same fashion, if they move forward and I take a diagonal, you know, I didn't have to go very far. The amount of a step that I've taken is about this much. And as they close, I've already killed them, and I'm protected. So with the compass steps, rather than just taking a straight linear line, we kind of take an angled step, but we're also curving it down. Talhoffer, yeah, we're changing the line. Talhoffer calls it leaping like a gazelle. To leap spryly with your longsword like a gazelle. I don't leap very well.
Maybe not quite like that.
But you know, it's a step where you compass, and you can compass the other way, and you can throw blows while you're doing this compass. Meyer introduces the concept of gathering in his dusack section, where if he takes a step, he'll gather the back foot in preparation to take another step. And that step may be with the front foot. It may also be with the back foot into a direction, and gathering with your front foot, which is now become your back foot. So these are all types of footwork that become very important as we start working this cone, or this box,
Right.
and not the cone.
And one thing that it also allows us to do when we're using this box defense is actually, especially when we're dealing with and against cuts,
Yep.
is we can remove the power of our opponent's cut by extending the angle between us and stepping out from underneath it. So now the place where their power is being driven isn't where we are anymore. Or we can step into their cut and intercept their cut before it develops power by using these angled steps.
Right.
Right. So if Alison's throwing a cut at me, and I just make that same angular step that she made, so when she comes and throws that cut, this is where that impact is going to be. If I try to parry that, I'm going to receive all of the impact of her body and blow. And when she goes back, as she comes at me and I step this direction, now I'm receiving her on the back end after she's developed power. And even if she tries to follow me with that blow, I've just enough distance between us
This is going to end poorly for me.
that as she tries to follow me, she's still coming, and do it again, and really just try to, I'm going that way, try to hit me. I'm still extending that blow over into it where it can't join forces with her body. I can be strong and stable, and vice versa. If I step into the other angle and block the blow, I can intercept it before it develops power. And now I catch her sword before her body can actually get behind it, and I can do all sorts of other things from there. But what we're doing is, by not staying on the linear line, by moving to the angles, we can change the leverage of our opponent's blow.
Right, and some of the footwork we showed was all front foot forward, this foot's moving. You can also, gather and take a step with the back foot, and now you've got a very good rotation, and you can change the line of where the front foot's going and completely reorient your body in a different position. We can do that in the other direction as well, because I can reorient this way and change direction. So now my left foot, Bertan calls it goofy foot.
I thought goofy foot was sword foot forwards.
I thought it was the other foot forward. Anyway.
Other people can answer that question.
It's in rapier would be your non-dominant
Right.
foot is forward. But now it's my forward foot. And what I'm actually prepared to do by taking this step and moving this position here, if I'm in bulwark, or I'm in a low guard, or even if I'm in a high guard, this is a power generation step. This is where I can now come because I'm wound. And I can unwind in a compass step and drive into my opponent. So with footwork, the masters are often left foot forward, right foot forward, and then there's a whole lot of, well, we don't really care, it depends on what you're doing next. As to which foot is going to go forward, and it really depends on what blow you're throwing next, as to what you end up doing.
Yeah.
But again, they're not going straight forward in. And they're not doing those nice little happy
Right.
Italian rapier steps.
Well,
or
modern fencing
rapier.
steps. Yeah.
Modern fencing
Modern
steps.
fencing steps.
The
Or
modern-
classical fencing. We call it classical fencing step.
Classical fencing.
If you've
where you-
watched modern Olympic fencing, you might
With
get
the-
confused.
with what we train almost every new person to do
Right.
in the SCA is that forward and retreating step.
Right.
We're telling you, no, go off angle, go take a compass.
Right. We're
Go in a
opening
circle.
and we're opening our base to accommodate
Opening our
that,
hips.
and using even if I'm taking that compass step with my left foot, I'm not bringing my left. I might be, but I'm
Right.
not always bringing my right shoulder back.
Right.
I might be stepping forwards with my left foot and keeping my right shoulder in line so that I can continue to fight out here. And this is just as good
Right.
as this. In fact, sometimes it's much better.
Right. Because when you're in that other position, you're wound again.
Right. And
You're still wound. All you need to do is bring the other foot forward or off to the side, and you're again have closed distance and created the illusion that you're further away from your opponent than you actually are.
And I'm more stable for like leverage in this position than I am necessarily in this position,
Right,
which is
'cause if
really
we're-
good in a very straight line, but not good.
Right, and if
Side
we're
to
if
side.
we're arguing in a bind with our swords in this position, depending on where I am, I actually have more leverage against this. But if Lot is the way he was before, I have a lot less things I can do with this. It's a lot more stable, and I don't really want to play with this too much.
Right, and it depends. Of
It
course,
depends.
it depends
It always
because there's always because I can be stable here too if I'm again addressing in the right line and I've stepped forwards. But the thing to take away, I think, from this is especially if you're coming from rapier into cut and thrust, start thinking about breaking some of your footwork habits, and don't just train this simple advanced step if you're doing the classical heel toe or sort of a more Renaissance just pat of the foot thing. Either way you're doing it, especially if you're coming in from Italian or Spanish even, and you're used to, simply making these advanced retreats, start thinking about broadening your base and how to move in angles because they support this box action.
Right.
Right? And before, I guess we should take
You
questions.
should ask if there are any questions.
Right, before we start moving into how to put those two things
Right.
together.
And so the one caveat I will have is as you're practicing this, you'll notice one of the words that we didn't use at all during this whole footwork demonstration.
Extravaganza.
No. Well, it wasn't extravagance. But what's the word we didn't use? Starts with L, ends in lunge.
Right, we did not use lunge.
We did not use a lunge.
Right.
Because we didn't need to.
Right.
And that's one of the is a really big difference with the cone versus the box.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've changed from this very linear attitude overall to a much more angular attitude in how we're fighting, and that's going to accommodate our swords really well. We'll look at that in a minute, but let's
let's see if
field
there's
any
any
questions
questions
before we do. I guess.
Anybody have any questions about the box or about footwork? Cool.
Yeah. How do rapier people normally describe foot position? Because when I was taught rapier, I was taught it as like offensive versus defensive. If you have your sword arm forward, you're in offensive stance. If you have your secondary arm forward, you're in secondary leg forward, you're in defensive stance.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
For sure. Do you want to take distinguishments
me?
on that? Yeah, I can handle it. You can cover your side. We'll both talk. Go ahead.
So I would say that your primary foot forward or your secondary foot forward, like your dominant hand, that's another way that people will say is because you use your dominant hand, that's your sword hand, and your dominant foot goes forward, is the typical rule of thumb when we're training rapier people that this is the law. And I will tell you that Gadinho, which is Iberian fencing, breaks that rule because he's like,
Yeah, but Gadinho is very much sort of that earlier style of cutting.
But he still won't break the rule.
Yeah.
Where it's a good example of either foot is dominant and either foot has the offensive position and the defensive position. A lot of the cutting, like what we just demonstrated, where Lot had one arm extended and the other one had both arms extended essentially, and had the body rotated with the non-primary foot in front. That's a very offensive position. And it's offensive because it's an illusion that you're further away from your opponent. You're wound and you're set for a strike, and you're actually closer to your opponent than your opponent thinks you are. So it's very offensive. It's not necessarily a defensive position. If they were, when you're back further, this may be a demonstration. So if I'm a standard rapier fighter, I've got my secondary and I got my primary sword, and generally I'm going to be in this sort of guard, right? You can very clearly see.
Your audio has just gotten very, very choppy.
Okay, I'm going to come a little closer. So when we're in,
Getting a lot of dogs too.
sorry,
Listen loud.
what?
You gotta be loud in the dogs.
I'll be loud. I'll be louder than the dogs. So when we're in this position, I have my dagger here, I have my rapier here, and for the most part, this is a fairly defensive position with my dagger and offensive position with my rapier. And this is what we tell a lot of people to do, is I can play with things out here, and I have room to do things out here. If I change that, where I've now moved my sword arm back and my dagger arm forward, they're about the same, and we would consider this potentially to be more offensive or more aggressive. It's not necessarily so, but it can be. So when Lot was in this position where the non-sword foot was forward and the dagger was forward and the rapier was also forward, while this may look like a defensive guard, it's not, because I'm wound to just strike, and I'm set to be able to take the initiative. So I think it is a whole lot of depends.
Yeah, but
And I'm going to let you expound on that.
yeah, because I think that like ultimately what we're looking at is primarily people traditionally in rapier get taught keep your sword foot forwards and make advancing retreating steps, or put your left foot forwards and then try to pass with your sword, and that's the most footwork they get their advice on. And what's not really happening is when you actually see like historical discussions on how to fight with your left foot forwards, even in a later rapier situation, they're not making, they talk about how slow that passes, so that if you're in normal guard and I'm in this position, you see this a lot in SCA rapier. Take a step kind of back a little bit. There you go, so I can be on camera, right? You see this a lot, and then what people are going to do is they're going to rush with their dagger and try to strike with their sword. And what that gives is a lot of time for my opponent to just disengage their point around, and then I run right onto their sword. And by virtue of the fact that all I'm doing is passing my foot forwards, instead of actually using my body to cover space as I step. So what I might do is, instead of just rushing forwards with my dagger, what I might do is step forwards with my sword and dagger. And now I've still trapped my opponent's sword because my sword hasn't committed to attacking yet. It's actually defending that line. Or if they make the much wider disengage to get around there as I step, now I can actually step in and catch the sword on the other side because I didn't commit to this big motion of step and pass. What I've done is made a small step to an angle, bound my opponent at the sword, and then when they choose to move, I can respond against their motion and close. Right? And all I'm doing is now stepping, again, now angularly in towards their sword, as opposed to stepping straight one more time. So I've angle stepped, and if I step straight, I get hit by their disengage. Because all I did was step straight, instead of making those angle steps and controlling space and distance between me and my opponent. Right? And even if I haven't struck them, I've now completely bound them out, and in my next action, because I'm much closer, I can put both my weapons on them. Right? So this is a more evolved footwork that I don't think we teach a lot in the SCA. Because we're so used to a game where we're trying to jump in and get out as fast as possible. And so you see a lot of that where I'm sweeping up with my dagger and then shoving in with my sword, and all she had to do was step away from it, slip distance and time, and I'm not really in control of space. And so I'm not saying that everybody's teaching wrong things. We're teaching good things, and they work really well for certain elements. But when we start to really incorporate some of these other elements into it, we can really change the dynamics of what we're doing in the fight.
Well, even once we start adding cuts into
Right,
the
because we can do the same thing, and if I start to come in, instead of disengaging under, throw a reverso. Yeah. So when I do that same thing, where I'm gonna do this and strike, and you're gonna throw a reverso while slipping away from my point, right? So as I come in here, right, I pulled it. Let me do it again. Same thing, yeah, exactly the same way, right? I come in, right? She stepped away. I thrust right into that space where she was, and there was nothing there for me because she made a compensing step and threw a cut against it, and there was no. I'm just going straight into there. There's no way I can combat that action. I can't parry it at all.
Right. There's nothing to parry.
Right. She's inside of my sword. She's inside of all of the actions.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or did we answer the question?
Did we answer the question at all?
Yeah, I think you won't confuse people coming from other martial arts as long as you avoid the term orthodox.
Okay.
Did we use orthodox?
Did we use orthodox? Traditional is usually what I say.
Traditional.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of the tradition that we're talking about is a classical foil-based tradition,
Right.
or épée-based tradition, and modern classical Victorian fencing that's built to be fought on a strip
Right.
in a very narrow space. And one of the things that we all love about the SCA is that it's fought in the round. And when we're using cuts, when we're in a more dynamic environment, that in the round becomes even broader
Super great.
as a way for us to really address.
But if you
the
look at
fight.
if you stand on the sideline of a lot of rapier fights, you'll notice here in Caid we have 40-foot lists, which is huge. It's great. It's a lot of space. We still fight in a lot of lines. There's still a lot of straight fencing, and while we may curve, it kind of shifts a little bit on the round, and then it's strip fencing, and then it'll curve, and then it's strip fencing, because that's the roots of SCA fencing, came out of that Victorian foil sort of collegiate fencing type environment.
I don't really see a lot of movement in a circular manner, except for the old-fashioned sizing up your opponent. When attacks are made, or when you have advance, recover, you're doing things, with the possible exception of when you cross legs, or you're doing things that almost look like what you would see in the wood cuttings. A lot of it still does look like modified strip fencing, even now, with all of the practice we do and with all of the manuscripts that we have access to. A lot of us still fall back on our collegiate fencing backgrounds.
Yeah, and that's because a lot of late period manuscripts too, even, or the sort of the later extended period manuscripts that we use for our rapier fighting, also advocate a fairly narrow lunging back and forth motion, because that's what works for the weapon we're using. The threat of the point is super important for a rapier. But when we start to look back a little further and we start to look into the earlier style swords and the more cut-oriented swords, you do start to see a lot more angular motions. I'm not going to say round motions.
They're angular.
But they're very angular.
So you'll see the compass step. The compass step is, the form that you will most likely see it is Spanish and Iberian fencing. Is you see those circular steps and those compass steps.
Where it's very well defined.
Where it's very well defined as far as rapier practice goes. But the especially in the German school is those kind of triangle hopping motions. And the angled steps. So using those lines, as I said, imagine there's a 45-degree line from where you're standing, and there's the 90 and the horizontal, and that kind of sets your stage of how to use those various lines and how to move. So it isn't necessarily in the round, but there's more, we call it offline stepping, I suppose.
Yeah. Angular stepping.
We call it angular stepping, but if you were to talk to a lot of other fencers, they'll call it offline stepping.
Offline stepping.
Because you're creating space offline,
and
not in that that straight line.
And to also sort of be clear on this, just because I'm starting with my left foot forwards and I'm making a step with my right foot, doesn't mean I'm making an offline step.
Right. You can still be going in that step.
That's what I just did.
Sorry, helicopter.
It's an outdoor studio. That, just like what I just did with the rapier and dagger, I was making a straight line step, even though I was passing my feet. It's still a straight. Initially, the one that got me killed was a straight step. Whereas when I was actually taking advantage of her sword, I was using angled steps. So I'd step to this angle, and then I'd step to this angle, and that's what allowed me to keep control of the space between us, and control her sword, utilizing almost. I didn't quite get there, but almost that same box, those box angles that we were looking at in the earlier bit.
Right, and one other thing that I want to point out with these angular steps and these non-linear movements, is that it's not just the feet that are moving, it's the body is moving, your shoulders are moving, your hips are moving, but it's a full body action. I mean, if you just move your feet and keep your body pointed forward, one, it's going to hurt, and two, it's not going to be effective. So, you know, a lot of times when you're taking these steps, you're actually turning your shoulders, you're turning your hips, and you're almost sideways. And that's what allows the points to go past you. And you're also, you know, you may be extending in this direction. And so it's not just the footwork, it's the rest of the body that comes with it, which is why you often see it more associated with the box rather than the cone.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples of this type of stepping
Sure.
in like a cone defense system, but you know, we talked about it last, I think,
Yeah.
primarily. So,
Do we want to demonstrate some of this stuff? Do we have any other questions
Yeah.
before we demonstrate some
those-
of these
hope we answered that question.
cutting and thrusting?
So we already actually started to look at the basic principles of it because I got excited and I started talking about that leverage.
You did get excited.
But essentially, that's the foundations of this. The foundations of these angles are exactly what we looked at earlier, where when Pandas threw that cut at me, I could take the leverage away and reorient the fight to a position where I have control of the center. What do we really mean when we talk about controlling the center of the fight? Right? We talk about this a lot. This comes up. Is he who has control of the center, or she, right? They who have control of the center, they are in control of the fight.
Right.
And it goes hand in hand with some of our other axioms of if my point is online, it is faster to thrust.
Right.
If my point is offline, it is faster to cut.
Right.
And using distance as time. So if I'm in that boxed position where I've addressed your sword and taken away your opportunity to cut at me, and my point is online, now I can much more easily throw a thrust at you,
Right.
which is a faster action in that time than your cut is going to be, because you have to go all the way around to the other side because I've defended where your sword is. And that gives me control of the center and control of time in this action.
And it also allows for a decision point. So you can throw a thrust and not actually intend to hit your opponent. Because if your opponent isn't necessarily doing anything, and you've turned the point into a thrust from a cut, potentially, you're asking a question. And the question you're asking is, one, are you going to do anything? And if the answer is no, stab them. If the answer is yes, then we have a whole bunch of different opportunities. But generally the answer is not stab them, but turn that thrust into a cut.
Right. So let's start looking at that with arming swords, because we haven't done any.
Arming sword, yeah.
Arming sword is one of my favorites.
It's one of Lot's
I get to play
favorites.
with my favorites.
So I'm not going to do this with the secondary, so you can actually see what the sword is doing.
I'm going to use my secondary because A, it looks cool, and B, you'll see how I use this to accompany the arming sword to create my defense. Because as much as I'm going to use primarily my sword on this, if with a simple cross, and you see this example historically, with a simple cross, when I'm putting my sword out there to defend it, that hand is very, very vulnerable if I don't have any protection over it. So what my buckler is primarily going to do in my box structure is going to defend my hand. And once I've gotten control of the center, my buckler is going to finish that control and free my sword to do other things. So for instance, we've looked at this very simple cut action where Alesone, the Panda's going to throw a high cut in my head, and if I were a rapier fighter, I would try to parry that, right, like this. And one, especially if my buckler drifts back and my hand drifts out, this is already cutting into my fingers, and I can lose my fingers over the sword too. She's deflecting my point past her head the other way, just with a straight line cut, and I'm not actually defending the leverage of her blow. So this has become very bad for me. If I really wanted to do that, I would pull my hand.
And I've already struck him in the head.
It's already struck me in the head. If I would pull my hand back a little bit from my cross and try to get as far towards her sword as possible, and lean into it, and I would lunge, right? And this is still going to be bad, but she throws that cut, and I could try to lunge, but even then, that's really hard for me to do in that time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn up into that defended ox position or high position. I'm going to align my edge to her blow, and I'm going to defend my hand with my buckler. So when she throws that blow, now not only have I caught it on my sword, which would be fine without my buckler, but my buckler is also aiding in defending my hand. And at this point in time, my point is closer to her and to the center of the fight. So I can push that thrust towards her, and if she doesn't do anything, it's going to smack her in the face, right? So I'm not trying to thrust at the exact same time as my defense, because it's impractical against this weapon. I would have to be much closer and much further forwards in this instance against this broader shoulder cut especially, right? So we're here, and I'm in whatever guard, it doesn't really matter where I've started from. I'm going to assume that defensive position, take away her opportunity to hit me, support my hand with my buckler, and put myself in a position to thrust her in the face. And now, now's a really good time for me to thrust on the back end of this, right? The way I want to do this is I don't want to pull my sword away from her sword, because again, it's still heavy leverage, and these swords can be deflected in that fashion. So if I did pull my sword away, right, and pushed it this way, now I've given her access to the center again, and she's able to defend that in a cone, because it's now a thrust-oriented game, and I haven't been attacking her with a cut. So what I want to do is keep leverage on that. I'm actually going to move my body, and it doesn't matter which foot we do this with, because of our footwork, I'm going to step angularly into the sword as I do that. Ready? So here we go. High cut. There's my defense, and now I step angularly in. I take leverage away from her sword, and I strike her in the face. Right? I'm pulling my point above her head because she is not wearing max. But that's fine, right? This is the basic principle of how this box works. It works in all four quadrants. Right? So if she were to throw a low cut, right, down into a lower opening.
Do you want to do the high cut?
Yeah, that's fine. Do an interhound. We did the high cut. So she throws a low cut into the lower opening because reasons, right? Again, I fall on that blow. Here. I was talking. That's on me. Right? Be ready. Always be ready to fence. Ready? All right, here we go. I'm in my guard. She throws that blow. I fall on that blow down. Right? If I had gone up here, she would have hit me in the fingers. So I fall on that blow down. I defend it with my hand. I leverage into the sword, and I can thrust around it. I force her to make any sort of wide action, but even in that time, it's going to come in pretty fast and quick. So we'll do that. I'll finish it more in time. Ready?
Ow.
So I pick that sword up, boom, and then I step into that line as I thrust against it. Same thing happens on the outside if I defend over here. Same thing happens on the outside again. When I defend that outside line, I want to pull my buckler over to defend my hand and support it from below, because that's where their sword is coming in. And I want to roll my buckler over. I can do this theoretically, but ultimately, if I'm defending that high line, I want to roll my buckler up with my hand and defend that high line on the outside. She throws it. There it is. I've caught it. I've supported my fingers. I thrust in against the weapon, pushing towards the weapon. Right? This is fundamentally how this box works. And how the angle works. I can also use stepping out against the blow, like we talked about earlier, to make the blow less, to take away strength from her attack. So the same high cut, that big strong high cut. This time I'm going to step angularly as I defend with the box. And now it's much easier for me to defend that, and I'm in a very good position to strike her in the face, because she's no longer anywhere near the center of the fight, because she's now on this line, and the center's over here.
Right.
So by making those angled steps, I can use those defensive motions to give myself control of the center.
Right.
So let's flip this around. Right? Now my opponent is going to be doing the really good defensive actions, right? We looked at how to sort of use timing cuts and pulling cuts to get around these types of defensive actions. But at some point, we're going to get into a position where one or the other of us has advantage of the sword. They're going to have an overbind, right? Like if I were to have cut up from below, against the outside of your arm, and she was now in an overbind, right? And if she had a buckler, she'd be defending her hand, right? And so I can't attack her hand. What I can do is, if she pushes that overbind on my sword, is I can rotate that out and strike from the other side. This looks exactly like a disengage in rapier, except for I'm just turning it into a cut. And we talked a little bit about that, about how to turn disengages into a cut. If I have the right distance, I don't have to cut. I can make that a thrust. So if we do the same thing, and we fall into the overbind, I can rotate that out and just make a simple disengaged thrust. But one other thing that we can do is we can fight for leverage. So if I have a really smart opponent, she's not going to give me heavy pressure on that overbind. Right? She's just going to put her sword there so that I can't attack through it. So we do the same thing. And now there's just enough pressure that I can't attack through it. If I push, she counter pushes, right? And now that's really bad for me. But if I disengage and I move that hand, she's ready to counter against it and counterbind on the other side. Right? We see this a lot. This is very typical in rapier, when somebody disengages the sword, where she's in control of the center, and that's bad for me. And one of the ways that I can accommodate this, and again, this works with all weapons. You see it very much in these heavier style blades, in the earlier style of fighting, is by turning my sword in a way that we call a winding. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my sword and kind of flip edges against her weapon. It does two things. One is it's going to change the natural position of my sword against her sword, and I'm going to gain leverage against it. Two, if these were sharp swords, there's something to consider that we don't have to deal with a lot in the SCA, is if you're fighting with actual sharp edges, those edges actually have enough grip, right? That there's enough traction in the edge that when edges touch, they bind just a little bit. They stick, right? They stick to each other's edge. And you can stick to your opponent's edge. And if I were to try to push up and down on the edge, like we can do easily, with dull blades, it doesn't necessarily work that well with sharp blades. And so this technique, obviously developed by sharp swords, it not only it works really well for us in sparring, it's also should work really well with sharp swords, because what's happening is once we've gotten to that position where our edges are in contact, I'm actually going to twist so that in this spot I'm turning my flat to her edge, and now I don't have the edge sticking issue, and then I can re-stick the edge on the other side. So by flipping that edge and turning upwards, now I've created a new leverage position without pushing on her sword. Because we know what happens if I push. We looked at this, I think, last session, right? If we get in here and I don't like my position, I go, ah, and she maybe even thrusts at my face, and I go, ah, and I push it away. She cuts back on the other side, and that's no good for me. So what I'm going to do is do this winding position. So we get back into that spot, and knowing that anything I do from here is going to be problematic, I'm going to wind, and now I've taken control of the center. I've gotten my point on her, and again, I'm going to put leverage into the sword. I still don't want to be stepping away from her sword, because the instant that I step away from the weapon, once I've created a dominant leveraged position, she's going to take that back away from me, right? So we're back in here, and I've done this, and if I step this direction, she can push on that, just push back, just push right through it, right? So we're here, I make the wind, I was here, I want to keep the same footwork. I make the wind, but then I step away and I give her all the leverage she needs to strike in against me and counter leverage against my sword. Because what I did was I stepped away from the weapon. So I still want to maintain my leverage going into that sword as I do that.
But
Yeah.
one of the things that I want to point out is as Lot is doing his footwork, you see that he's taken an offline step and then come straight in. So he didn't go straight in. So
Right.
there's still that, that offline, and it's not a very big offline, it's just a small one, but it's enough to be able to do the wind, take back the leverage, and then now they're poised to come straight in.
It probably would have been better of me to do this whole thing stepping forward with my left foot in the initial action, and then I could step forward with my right foot when I create the leverage on the bind. And now this is where we get into examining those types of footwork. And I can do it with either foot like we just looked at, but one can lead to a more comfortable success than the other depending on how your body works.
Right. So are there any questions so far before we move into
There's a lot of different ways to wind the sword, and realistically it's about kind of turning the edge of your sword in order to readdress leverage, right? You don't, the whole point of this is to address leverage. Yeah, I see a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. You talk about the sharp swords actually binding on the edges.
Yep.
Don't we have access to the simulators that have either the weighty or the somewhat.
You mean the
Double
foundation?
No. There are synthetic simulators that have simulated edges. They're a little chunky for my personal preference.
I totally get that.
Yeah, I will say this. Some of the best simulators on this that I've done is if you have a synthetic weapon, put grip tape or like a traction tape on the edges of the synthetic sword, especially if it's got a broad edge, like a black fencer or a penty. We've done that. And that gives you just enough of that little like bite to kind of really feel it. I've also actually gotten to play with blunt-tipped rapiers with sharp edges and feel the binding between the edges. We had to be very careful because the edges were sharp, but the tips were blunted, which allowed us to do the thrusting action safely and feel the real small amount of grip that you get in a rapier contact.
Do you know what, one of the things that I used to help me understand the binding, ironically enough, was rattan wrapped with hockey tape as opposed to duct tape.
Mhm.
So the
Yeah,
hockey tape
I can
doesn't
see that.
get as chewed up when you clash the rattan. And it's just sticky enough that you can't slide. We can't do the rapier sliding off the sword sort of bind. You actually have to do a real bind with it and actually turn the rattan in order to be able to then execute the thrust.
Yeah.
And I found that to be an interesting tool. And if you are interested in what the sharps on sharps feels like, take 2 kitchen knives, sharpen them, and then put them edge to edge, and you'll feel the stick. because I don't know if people are familiar with what knife edges look like, but knife edges they're not straight like this. They're actually kind of crossed, and you actually have to hone them in order to get those tines to those parts of the edge to line back up, which is why chefs have honing steels, because it's very easy for them to get, out of alignment again. And it's very, it's microscopic, you can't see it with the naked eye, but you can definitely feel it in your knives when your knives aren't necessarily sharp, and you can hone them back into a point. But that's something people can do at home. If you wanted to see what, the edge on edge with two sharp knives feels like, you can do it with kitchen knives. Any other questions?
Or do you want to follow up on that?
No,
Okay.
actually,
Yeah, it's really, I'll say this, there are some subtleties to it that really only come out when you're playing with binds, which we
Right.
should maybe talk about binds a little bit. And,
I think we should come back to binds.
okay. Here, we'll talk about it now.
Yeah. We're gonna come back to binds.
We'll come back to binds.
'Cause we're
But
gonna-
there are some subtleties to this edge play
Right.
that if you're working with sharps, do come out. It's again subtle. So if you're going bash and crash against your opponent, you're not going to feel it. There's not going to be a difference to you. But if you're playing with these sliding motions and these winding motions, there's reasons. There's a lot of advice on gliding. I tend to not promote gliding when I discuss fencing. I don't like to glide down my opponent's edge. What I do is this rotational action of winding the sword, whether it's from the outside like we looked at by rotating kind of upward, or from the inside by rotating inward. What it does is it takes those edges, here, put your edge out. It takes this moment of binding on the inside where we're on that edge, where with these swords, I'm not going to feel anything, but if it was a real sharp sword and we were pushing on each other with just enough pressure, there'd be a moment of sticking. But what I can do is just by rotating a little bit, all of a sudden all of that pressure, all of that stick goes away. And you see this rotation in historical manuscripts for that reason and for the advantages of leverage that it gives you.
All right, so we're going to show you some of the same types of concepts with a different weapon. So this is a dusack simulator. These are not legal in the SCA to use. We use them for training here. Hopefully we'll have some steel dusacks in our arsenal soon. But it's a single-bladed weapon and essentially a dull back.
are those the Purple Heart ones?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
These are the non-flexible versions.
Right, so they have a little flex,
Yeah.
but again, these are nylon. They have a nagel. We use them for training. They're not legal in the SCA, but dusacks are a whole lot of fun.
Yeah.
And there are some techniques that specifically Meyer with his dusack training gives us in how we turn cuts into thrusts, and how we can turn a cut into a thrust and back into a cut. And the first one we're going to look at is the waker, right? Yeah, we're going to look at the waker. And basically, what's going to happen is I'm going to attack my opponent from a high guard, and they're going to defend. And from there, based on what they do, this is where we ask that question when my dusack is going to come in contact with his. If he does nothing, I'm going to stab him. If he does something, then I'm going to probably turn the thrust into a cut. I'm not going to continue the same action of trying to push my thrust into his face. So we're going to start with the basic one of I'm starting high, I have a very high guard, and I'm going to go right for his head. So he blocks it, and at this point I'm blocked, and we're going to wait. I'm going to see what he's going to do. He is going to hang out there. I'm going to turn this into a thrust, and you'll notice I've already started taking a foot. So if he does nothing, I'm just going to thrust him in the face. If I perform this action and we get to the here and I get to the bind and they take another action, like they start to move their sword up, I've now come off and now I can hit him in the hand. But you'll see what I just did. I went this way. I'm not going straight at him. I'm taking his wrist. In theory, I'm also taking his head at the same time, but I'm protecting my head from this position. He can't really do anything. He's gonna run into my dusack, and I'm going to kill him before he can potentially power through that. But if I come straight in doing that same sort of action, and I don't take any step to get essentially protected, this goes very badly for me. So again, we start in high guard, I throw the cut, I see the wind, he brings it up, and I come straight in. Okay? So again, with the maneuver that we have, going straight in on the body is a really bad idea. Coming offline with the cut to his arm or the cut to his head, I'm protected in this direction. He can't get me. Okay, and I can continue and be in a nice stable space. If for some reason,
And really, that's just a modification of that box defense, right?
Right.
Like you're coming over here, and you're not trying to cut straight in. You're coming over here to defend me, and you're removing the
Right.
strength I have in my cut.
right. Any questions on that?
So I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You're okay.
You had something
Nope.
that was fine. Okay.
No. So another way that I can do this is that if my opponent is standing in a high guard and protecting their head because they're a smart fencer, and I'm looking at this going, I don't really want any part of this, and they're not doing anything. They're just kind of hanging out and blocking their head. I don't want to come low because they're just going to come in, even though this whole area right here is exposed, it's a bad idea for me to hit that. So what I'm going to do,
Actually, try to hit them. I'm wearing a mask, but I can.
yeah, this ends poorly for me. If I try to go in from the other direction, if I try to, fake them, and come out this way, it still ends poorly for me because even though their head's protected, they can move a lot faster than I can. So in this position, especially if they won't do anything, I have to start the conversation. And the conversation may go something like this. You do anything? You gonna perform an action, or am I gonna stab you in the face? And that's again where that conversation happens. You aren't doing anything. I'm gonna force you to do a thing. Now my point is online, pointed at your head. Are you going to do anything? And the answer is yes or no. If the answer is no, I'm just gonna stab you. If the answer is yes, so we come in, we're here, I knock, and they block, now I can go, okay, great. I have options. I have things that I can do from this position. But again, it's the conversation.
Right, and what we're looking at is using that point as kind of an entry with the thrust. Like you showed two different directions. You showed I'm entering with a cut, but I'm binding that blade, and now what do? Well, I'm going to wind that point in and say, okay, here's an action. Are you responding to this, or my point's going straight at you?
Right.
Or, okay, well, maybe I'm not throwing a cut in. Maybe I'm going to start with that point in the
Right.
same fashion. And is it going to land? Maybe not. But mostly it's there to force me to do something.
It's the start of the conversation. So turning your cut into a thrust, again, are you going to do anything? No? Great. Let me stab you. Are you going to do something? Great. Now you're doing the thing I actually wanted you to do because I have a cutting weapon. I want to cut with it. I don't want to stab you. One of the other things that we can do in the same sort of vein is if my opponent attacks me, you attack me in high. So I'm guarding, I'm happy, blah, blah, blah. I'm here, my opponent's going to attack me. Now I'm gonna block it, right? So now he's made the cut, I've made the block, now I can thrust. Are they gonna do anything? No. Are they gonna do anything? Bop them in the head. So the response of turning a cut into a thrust and doing that winding action on their blade can happen if they throw the cut first. All right, I've made the block. Okay, are you gonna do anything? Okay, no. If you're, then I'm gonna stab you. It can happen when I'm on the attack. So either way, depending upon how you defend or how you attack, you can turn that bind into a thrust, and then either thrust or counter it again back into a cut. I know.
What's
Will we
that
drop
one?
the other one?
The other one, yeah.
It's the other flip.
Is it a flip? Whatever.
Yeah, it's the one where I come over the top of your sword.
Yeah. So it's the same idea. It's the same idea, and it doesn't really matter whether I'm cutting from right or left. She's going to defend it in the other side, and then she's just going to threaten the other side of my face, just because it's cool.
Wait, what is it?
You're doing this one, the stork speed.
Oh, am I gonna?
That one, no. This one is opposed to that one. This was the blonde.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Doop-a-doo.
Right, so I come in with that same cut. She's now defended the other side. Her dusack's the other direction, and this gives her a real nice turning thrust from there, and that forces me to absolutely do something against it, and opens me up to the other side.
And so you'll see how, again, I didn't attack straight in that line. The first step was, okay, we're coming this way. Okay, great. Now I'm here. Now I step here.
Right.
So I've stepped off line. The center line is still going this way. And then when they decide to do something, then I moved back the equation over to the other side.
And she's defending with that angle, that box angle, as she's cutting through.
Right. Any questions on that? So this is with a dusack. Did you want to show them with the saber?
You can. Well, we don't have sabers.
No, but we have Maestros.
Okay.
You kind of act like sabers.
I was just going to show. So this is fun because we were using dusacks, but it doesn't really matter. This that outward sort of waker, we'll call the waker action, or that outward winding action, can be used in a lot of different ways. And it doesn't really matter kind of what swords, but what you find is we were doing a lot of these hockey guards. What you see a lot, especially saber fighters, people who are used to saber fighting, is they use this sort of A-frame defense. And with a sword that's got a slight curve to it, I can use that same waker action as I throw that angle, that diagonal or even horizontal blow, and as soon as it connects, I can turn the hand around again and step in. Now this time, instead of, I want to step away from the sword, because the sword's kind of going that way. So in this case, because we're going around it, I want to get free from her sword, and I want to kind of step into this space, because now I'm away from the point. Right, and I can use the cross or the guard, the little nagel, to bind against the weapon as I go.
Something with beep beep beep.
Yeah, it was probably the GoPro going, I am out of batteries.
All right, cool.
That tells me what time it is.
Cool.
So we're using, depending on how that sword is used, it doesn't necessarily have to be this dip over. You can do the same thing actually with the dip under, right, against that low cut. And we see this actually comes up in rapier more than anything else, I think. But if you're in, let's say, straight parry, and I throw an Unterhau up into here, you're going to sort of fall on it with the slice, right? So we did that same thing where I come in and I gain in here. As soon as that connects, I can drop that point in and throw upward, because what's happening is I'm turning around the point of rotation. This also happens in German rapier a lot, where you turn around that point of rotation. So I come up in here and I just let it fall off, and I'm moving away from it and driving in with my point as that happens. So it's that same motion where we're turning a cut into a thrust, because we've started the initiative with a cut, and then we can use that same winding action. This time, instead of winding against the sword, we can wind around the sword.
We're wind
Right.
around it.
Yeah. Actually, can we go back to arming sword for a second?
Oh, I suppose.
Because this gets into binding.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to winding.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions about winding?
About sort of that winding, whether we're winding inside the sword, outside the sword,
Where we turn
kind
the
of how these
cuts,
concepts
cuts into
play.
thrusts,
Cuts
that type of thing? That all makes sense? Everybody's good? Okay.
Because this really leads. Yeah, go. Nope.
I think that was a yes.
Okay.
And yes.
Yeah, excellent. Because this really leads right into kind of this idea of let's start first with the idea of like entering with a thrust instead of we've been entering with a cut a lot, and
That's because these are cutting ones.
that's because these are cutting weapons. But you don't have to, and to be honest, you shouldn't. Throwing cuts indiscriminately can be very, very bad. What we see a lot of in with these weapons is this idea of either entering with a thrust or the concept of straight parrying and putting our sword out there. Because I have an opponent who really wants to cut at me with that big, broad cutting action. She's got a big broadsword and she wants to hit me with it. Well, if I just stick my point out there, all of a sudden now she has to do something against this. She can't, especially if I'm well trained in my box, she can't just come and cut at my head. Because all I'm going to do is fall against that cut. And I've got control of the center by the very nature of having put my sword out there. So I can start from back out of measure in one of my sort of postures or guards, and as I come forwards, instead of just driving a cut out there and trying to reach as far as I can come in and put that thrust into the center of the fight. And now I've got control of the fight, and I'm in that body mechanic that I'm ready to go one way or the other as soon as she lays in against that sword and maybe strikes it out of the way or defends it with a broad action. I can come around, I defend wherever her sword might be coming in, and I counter-strike immediately to an opening.
That's what we need in this episode.
Carry on.
Helicopters.
Helicopters. Oh yeah, have you ever the helicopter defense? Okay. So what's she gonna do against me, or what am I gonna do against an opponent who's going to do this? Because any broad action I make is going to be problematic. One of the things we've looked at again is using pulling cuts and deceptions to try to draw our opponent into a wider parry than they might want to make. But one of the other things that we see very regularly is binding against the weapon. So here you can have a buckler.
Everyone gets a buckler.
Everybody gets a buckler now. Grab your buckler. So you're entering in straight parrying and defending your hand from my cut, right? So, right, you're going to put it out there and point it in my face. You're going to take away this action. If I step over here and cut at your head, you're going to turn that up in your box defense, right? If I step under here, you do your box defense.
Not that box
Just fall
defense.
on top of it, right? Just fall on it with a slice, right? If I step in here, box defense, right? Box defense and ox. Box defense, right? Army swords.
Bucklers,
Yeah.
not my favorite.
All you gotta do is do your thing. Anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The point is, she's got her box defense up, and it's problematic for me. So what I can do is, when she's in that position, is instead of getting close, I can put my sword on top of hers. We've looked a little bit at this in other weapons forms. You see this in rapier all the time. We see this in all sorts of things. We looked at this week 1, is covering the weapon with a cut. And now, if she tries to disengage or attack me in that time, I've bound the sword, right? I'm still in the center of the fight. she still has to take another step to hit me, and in that step, I'll do something against her weapon.
I don't like that.
Right. So this is the idea of binding is that I don't want to be pushing on my opponent's weapon. If I push, right, straight parry, and I come in and there my face. There we go. I come in and I push on this weapon. Well, what have I done? I give them momentum and time, and I'm not really in the center of the fight because my point is not really pointed at her. But we've come in, and we're now in this middle place where either one of us can. I've just taken maybe a little bit of advantage, right? What's really good for her to do? She, having been bound like this, is going to do that winding, right? She does the wind and pushes against me, right? Or if she doesn't respond to me, and we come into that bind, well, I can push that wind and take that leverage away. And all we're doing is I'm not trying to jump in and out. What I'm trying to do is create a guided action in this motion. I want her to either respond to my thrust or not respond to my thrust. Because if she responds to my thrust, she has to push it away. Right? And I gotta be watching for what happens next. As we come in and I bind and I start that wind and she sees it coming, so she defends against it. Now I can step to the other side and throw my next action in that time.
And I can't get there in time.
Right. If she tries to drop around or do something else that doesn't push my sword out of the way, I keep going forward and I'm going to turn my buckler and my sword to continue my defense. Right? So we're here, we're in this action. I start that winding, and if she drops away from it to try to disengage, I can continue forwards and defending against her weapon. What else could you do?
Is there anything in any of the later stuff in Pacheco, the Spanish, using the wind with
Winding is different in Spanish.
Yeah, wait. Finish the yes, but
in the Spanish, or for that matter in the German, or I haven't seen it in any of the Italian so far, but basically using a wind effectively with a rapier or a side sword.
Oh, yeah.
Something that's the longer weapon.
Well, so yes, what the Italians call it is gaining.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
And the Spanish call it narrowing.
And the Spanish call it narrowing, and the Germans still call it winding. Why do the Germans still call it winding? Because everybody in Germany goes back to Lichtenauer. And Lichtenauer called it winding. We will call it winding.
Right. Even though it doesn't look like Lichtenauer's winding.
And realistically, I'm calling it winding because I'm quoting Lichtenauer. I'm quoting the German tradition by calling it winding. But, you look at Fiore doesn't say necessarily wind, but he has the key position, the same as the Germans do, right? Why is this called the key? Because when I go forwards from here, it turns, right? And so we can go and then we can turn into the key and go again. And isn't this just winding the sword? And I can come from long point into finestra. Oh, look, what did I just do? I wound my sword in against my opponent's weapon. Actually, before we go to rapiers, let's look at the early, because I'm on topic, early period longswords, right? Well, the winding. Let's do. Okay, fine. All right. Yeah, we'll go back to rapiers.
Octavia, we'll come back to rapier.
Yeah, no worries.
Lots on a roll.
Lots on a roll, right? So, this is one of the things I wanted to describe anyway, because winding means many, many different things. When we look at that earlier Lichtenauer tradition and the ringyak and everything else, when we've come into that bind, right, with the longsword, and I'm going to turn my weapon, I'm going to wind up into ox. And I've completely flipped my edges, and I've done exactly what we're looking at doing. Right? I've wound into ox, I've turned my edges, I've created leverage, and my point is now online with her face. But when we look at the later period sources, This works better with a longer weapon. When we look at the later period sources, they've got longer weapons, longer handles, and instead of, once we've come to that bind, instead of winding all the way up into ox, which actually isn't really great for me at this distance, what Meyer does is take his pommel underneath the sword and winds over the weapon this way, and then turns the point or edge against the weapon. So you see, it's still called winding. It's still German, but it's a different mechanic. So now I've opened that action up by pulling my pommel underneath, and I can rotate it around into a cut, or I could place it into a thrust. And what you get, this is where actions like the window breaker come into play, right? Where,
well, if you drive me into ox.
oh yeah, if I were to go into ox, right?
Right.
Yeah, so if I go, if we're in that bind and I pull up into ox and then start to thrust, there's still so much my opponent can do against my weapon in that time, that type of action really comes into play. But this nice, with the longer handles, this what I call oaring action, where I can come all the way over. Now there's no...
The only thing I can do is...
Right, she can pull away, which is what I want. Right, and I can keep driving with my cuts then from that position. So I think the point I'm saying is that, like, I'm calling these actions winding. When you look at it in 133, they call it winding. It's much this is like 1300s and 1400s. You see this type of action specifically called winding. In the later 1500s, you see a whole different action called winding, which does the same ideas, the same thing. And when you're using the dusacks and the rapiers, it looks similar to maybe the earlier period stuff.
Can't you just work as soon as she pushes against your ox?
Oh, I could twitch. There's always an if and, right, sort of conversation here. And it comes down to a lot about distance. So if we go back to that bind, and I start my wind into ox, right? And you push on my sword. Now I'm going to twitch and fly around with the thwart cut to the other side. But if I start my thrust from ox, right? So we go back to that bind here, and I pull up into ox, and now I thrust at her. Now she goes into window breaker, and now I'm going to be well behind on my thwart. Right? Does that make sense? So the same actions, and this kind of goes back to our fundamental theories on this topic, is the same actions done in different times. There's different spaces between us and different motions. These can cause a cut or a thrust to be successful or unsuccessful. And the prime differentiation is managing and understanding the distance and action-reaction between you. Because in that motion, I'm not... Once I've come to that position and I come to this wind, I've put myself at a disadvantage. So if I thrust from here, she was in the advantaged position when I thrusted, and I wasn't, and that gave her time to respond. But if she pushes, if she goes early and pushes, she gives up that advantage because she didn't move into the center of the fight. Right. If she were to have done something else, like gone straight into a Scheitelhau, right, or a Schielhau, right, as opposed to a Scheitelhau. So we go back to the same thing. Boom, and I come into ox, and you lift and go straight into a cut to my head. Right now, that's the right timing for that cut. Oops. Whereas if she had pushed into the window breaker, which wasn't before she moved for the cut, she would have been giving up the advantage of time. Does that make sense? Because this is a really good This is a really good kind of demonstration of when a cut is right to do. Right?
Yeah, that was a great question.
So the idea is, if in that instance it's better for her to drive an aggressive attack at me and force me to be responsive than to try to take my sword out of the way, which gives me the opportunity to retake the initiative, because I'm no longer forced to respond to her driving. But if I'm now driving my thrust at her, it's a better idea for her to respond to that thrust rather than try to attack me directly, because then she'll have time on the back end of my action to attack me.
Right. Questions?
Questions on that? Or does that make sense? Because that's like, we're kind of really good. Awesome.
Makes sense to me.
All right, let's answer Octavia's question. So if we're in Spanish and we're in that honest measure, and neither one of us, we're at what we call even blades, right? You can, or even swords, right? So neither one of us has the advantage in this place.
That's
Nobody's placed in a Tahoe in order to try to gain the advantage. But the problem is if she makes that action while I'm standing still and ready, when she goes to place in a Tahoe, I'm going to move, right? So we're here, and she makes the Tahoe. I step around it in that time,
Okay.
right? Now, what she's going to, instead of making the Tahoe, she's going to wind the sword, which in Spanish they call narrowing, right? Which means she's going to take it with leverage. She's just going to put her point under my hilt, around it, and go straight forward.
Okay.
Right? And you can
Yeah.
she can do that, which is strong. Was it weak under strong? There's strong under weak, in which you attack my flank, as opposed to my chest, and lock my sword that way. Right? So she can lock my sword down here, and attack me here in that motion. And again, this goes right back to what we just talked about. Because this is an aggressive motion that is threatening me, it's much better than the Ataho, which isn't threatening me, because I'm lying in wait. But if I were doing an action like trying to attack her, the Ataho would be the better response, rather than
Right.
the narrowing. Right?
Okay.
So if we were here and I just decided to go forwards, Ataho is the right way to go. And now she can hit me however she wants. Right? But the narrowing is really good when we're in this questionable position and neither one of us has the advantage, and all of a sudden now she has an action that I have to respond to, because if I don't, I'm going to get hit.
So the other place that this comes in, really, it comes in handy, is when there is a size blade discrepancy between me and my opponent.
Yep.
So if I'm fighting 6 foot stupid, and they have a 44-inch blade, and I'm 5'6" on a good day, and my blade's 38. There is a distinct size advantage for height and generally really long arms, and now I'm fighting a really long blade. So the only way sometimes that I can get in enough and still be safe is coming in with narrowings.
And again,
It would strike me that also
So if, yeah,
There's-
so
it would strike me that there would also be some. Is there anything to the fact that you have the shorter blade? You have potentially the amount of space that you have to play leverage on is more substantial. You have less of a long arm out there that you get mucked around with.
yes and no. So what the advantage is that the narrowing, because I'm not losing contact with his blade, it's blade on blade contact, it's a blade on blade conversation, that if my opponent reacts as I am narrowing up their blade, I'm still maintaining contact with their blade.
Right.
So if a lot sticks his arm out, just stick your arm out, or with the rapier. So this represents stupid long and me with short and small. Actually, I'll use the dagger. That might be good. I've got my opponent who's stupid tall. They have a blade that's stupid long. I have a blade that's really short.
Right.
You know, as I come in, I can maintain as I'm coming up, and sometimes I may only need twice to go around the blade to come in. And
Right, you need to lock me out. You can't just.
you're not going around the
Right.
blade. You're still making contact with it, so that if they decide that they're trying to slip out from it, you can get the atajo or you can get a reverse.
Right.
But you're still doing that motion. It's just not a one-time thing. You can go a couple of times.
Right. But also the idea is she's provoking me, right? Like with
Right.
any of these windings, this action is a provocation. It's a threat to me that I need to do something. Now, because I'm so far away, I don't necessarily have to. I don't necessarily have to defend against it. But if so, here, you take the sword. If my first action is to lock out that sword here, right? I'm not going to continue to push it because then I push it right back into my face.
In your face, yeah.
What I want to do is lock it out and force them to move it. And now when they move it, I can continue to enter,
Right.
Right.
right? And that's, I think,
Did you get a cut?
I got a splinter of some type in my hand.
That's problematic.
Sorry.
So what this does is that, you know, because Spanish doesn't go far from the blade, it makes it seem like you have constant contact with it.
Right.
So even though they're moving, you've now rewound, but these are small motions, and it's really helpful with the longer blades that you can kind of ride up the blade to a position where, do you need thingies?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I was going to demonstrate the Italian version.
You can use this to the advantage that somebody's long and you have a shorter blade, because now you're essentially riding up the blade. You're forcing them to react, and depending upon how far they react, you know, they may just give you the atajo and you just continue the point. Because they're also small actions, they tend to be very quick actions, and so the amount of time for me to close distance, even on a very tall opponent with a very long blade, is very short. It's deceptively fast.
Fine as kind.
But
Fine as kind.
yeah, it buys me a lot of time, and realistically, this is somehow for a person of my size and the fact that I generally fight with a smaller blade, it's the advantage I have to take, because there's no way that I can kill them from back there, especially if they're fighting Italian and I'm fighting Spanish. I have to close distance.
Yeah.
But again, you're provoking them to move,
Right.
and then working inside their time, and that's realistically what all of these windings are designed to do. Is I'm not going to just push forwards indiscriminately off of a wind.
Right.
Right. What I want to do is, even if we come to a gaining or whatever, is if my opponent's not going to do anything, I'm going to start a thrust, and then when my opponent does something against it, I move, right? And that's the key to this wind. Is it's not just, okay, well, I'm going to gain leverage and then launch myself at my opponent, because there's always a way out.
Right.
And what we're trying to do is make incremental actions and incremental steps that communicate to our opponent that I'm gaining leverage, I'm driving against them, and I'm in the control, and I'm in the advantage, which forces them to do something
Right.
about it, right? I was going to do Fabrus's example, and then we can kind of move forwards, I think. But there's...
Actually, we're almost at the end.
Okay, great. But there's a wonderful demonstration of this in Fabrus, slightly different, because, again, we're ending with the winding. But here, switch real quick so they can see it. The idea is my opponent is shutting out the line in fourth. I'm going to make the disengagement or the colazione to threaten the arm. And what do people do when you threaten their arm? How are they going to parry that? They have to come down with the hand in order to parry the arm, right, or over. So what generally happens is, where I'm going to threaten under the arm and flank. And you can see that the hand comes down and the point comes up, right? And all I'm going to do from there is turn into prima, right? Does this look very familiar to what we just did with the arming sword. So we've done the same. So we've done the thing. She's threatening, closing the line of fourth. Just staying where you are, right? So I threaten low and then turn into first.
There's not a lot I can do from here.
Right, but there is if you use distance appropriately. But the idea is, I've got you're coming down into that bind.
Right.
I'm turning my edge and flipping up and changing that leverage, and it's now we're back into that lunging footwork that we started off the night saying, hey, this is not exclusive to what we do, but you can do this with your lunging footwork. You can do it with the heavier swords. You don't necessarily want to be doing it that way.
On that note,
Yeah,
we're going to
ran
open it
full
up
circle.
to full circle. We're going to open it up to any
Yeah,
questions
more
that anybody
questions.
has. We've been going for an hour and 45 minutes.
Yeah. So this is again a lot of information.
Yeah, we're gonna
Hopefully it's all kind of the same information, just a lot of different ways.
right.
Because that's
Yeah, we're trying to show you that the concepts are essentially the same. The weapons may change. With like the dusack, it only has one edge. So using the back edge for threats, you can't really cut anybody with it. You can hurt them. But in our game, you can just threaten them with it.
and it works for threatening the point. I mean, they have a point,
Right.
and,
It has a
that's
point.
that's
Stab
kind of
them.
the goal. That's kind of the goal of tonight is we're working with that point.
Right.
And showing lots of different ways that we can, use that point both on entry,
Right.
after a cut, to provoke our opponent into doing something that opens them up for the next action. Whether our next action is another thrust or it's a cut, or whether it's okay, bind my sword, so that all I'm going to do is turn against your sword.
Right.
And then I'm going to take the control back to my side, and that entry thrust, that winding thrust that they have to then push away or do something about, becomes a serious threat that
Right.
gives you an opportunity to do something on the other side.
As we said, the thrust for a lot of these weapons is the start of the conversation. It's the okay. I've now turned my point into a thrust. Are you going to do anything? No? Great. Let me stab you. Are you going to do something? Oh, hey, there's a response. Great. Now I can turn this back into a cut, which is what I wanted to do to begin with.
Right. Yeah, but what we're trying to get away from is this
Fencing tag.
this fencing tag, is the jab and retreat, jab and retreat,
Jab and
jab and
retreat.
retreat.
Yeah.
It's invasive to a lot of fencing because of some evolutionary training that comes a lot from a lot of modern training
Culture.
and a lot of culture.
Yeah.
And people not working with the swords in a way that transitions.
Right. It's super important to understand that every sword has a strength and every sword has a weakness. And you can use the weakness to an advantage, sometimes to get back to the sword's strength, or as a deception, or, just as a threat. And so we really wanted to highlight the fact that some of these bigger, beefier weapons still thrust.
Yeah.
And they still have points, and they
It's-
still can do a lot of damage.
It's really amazing how much of 133 looks like Fabris.
Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
boil it down. When you boil it down. So you can
What? All fencing's the same?
Oh, what?
It's Lot's favorite time game.
Hey, are you trying to say that all fighting's the same?
All fighting is the
The
same.
details are important.
The details are important, and there are these techniques carry over. They're not just steel techniques. They're not just rapier techniques. You could use them in rattan. I've used them successfully in some instances.
I use this winding thrust kind of over as my principal kill shot in heavies at this point. Is hit him in the grill. That's about what I'm working for. Is work that point in on the grill.
But it's a valid technique. But it's also the how to use the binds. Because almost all the disciplines have some sort of I'm gonna make a contact with your sword. Now what do I do with it?
Right.
And turning it into something that's productive. Either through power generation and another cut, or turning it into a thrust,
And mixing in thrust gets away from the hack.
Right. It offers variety. It keeps you. I don't want to. Relevance the wrong word. What word am I looking for? It keeps you. It keeps your opponents guessing.
Yeah.
Like it makes your fighting more well-rounded. It's a big proponent of it. And
we're still talking. We said questions.
Sorry.
No. That's not on you. That's on me too. We keep talking. Are there questions?
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah. What happens if you kind of go too far the other direction? Because there's no grappling, right? But
Not
if
yet.
you end up in like that Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader position where you're pushing on each other, that doesn't sound super safe. Do you just call a break at that point?
It depends on your opponent,
Yeah, no.
and
So
it depends on your kingdom.
true, but yes and no, but always technique wins out, right? And this is where we showed things like the short edge cuts. Have we done focus on short edge cutting?
Nope.
No, we really haven't.
We haven't.
Maybe we have a class 7.
Short edge cutting.
So
I like the short edge.
that's
I hate the short edge.
Yeah, I love the short edge. So, and we looked at it pretty briefly, but it's the same as winding, right? It's the same concept as winding.
Yeah. Good night.
All right. It's the same concept as winding. If I throw that winding action at my opponent as a cut, right, which we looked at with the longswords too a little bit. When I get into the bind, once I get into that bind, I should never get to the point where I'm that close and have no answer, because at some point somebody pushes, and once they push, you can just let them go, if that makes sense. So let's do that real quick.
Yeah,
Let's
because
do it with
in the
longswords
SCA, screw it and just wrestle isn't an option.
Right. That's, but ultimately,
Oh, we're going with longswords?
Yeah, we'll do it with a couple of them. But the idea is that we've gotten through the initial measure of slicing. I've laid on with an action or two. I'll do Myers opening, high low.
All right.
Right, you're going to defend that first one, and then I come in, boom, right, and we get into kind of a bind, and then maybe I roll in to here, and we get into kind of this position, right, where our swords are locked up. But here's the thing: is I can still wind around and strike. Right, I don't have to, in some of the manuscripts, what they might do from here. What I might do from here, if I were actually Myers, hook my pommel in, throw her to the ground, and then strike, right? Or I might throw my arms around, right? We might get back to that position. I might step in, throw my arms around her arms, and take her over this way, and throw her over my hip. I might grab something and twist it. I might grab her pommel, right? So we get back in here. I might reach in here, grab her pommel, and do something from there. And now we get into kind of a wrestling match, right? We can't do any of that in the SCA, but there's always a leverage play.
Right.
There's always, once you're in tight, there's always either this motion, which is that back edge cut towards her head, where I can throw that around, or she can throw it at me, or there's this motion where I can cut around to the other side. And so there's, or, right, I can push on that weapon, get it away from me, and step out and strike. I haven't touched her at all. I've only touched on her sword. I've pushed sword to sword. I haven't even touched her sword.
Right.
And theoretically, I can do that too. We can be up in here. I can hand check and step out as well if I want to. And that works better with maybe a single-handed sword than maybe the longsword. But once we're up in here, there's always a cut, right? There's always a cut.
Doing this, go ahead and fight back a little bit. Doing this
Right.
does nothing.
As soon as I do that, as soon as I push on her at all, as soon as we get in here and I push this way, she's going to cut down against me. And and throw something in that's going to attack me, right? There's almost always a way to get at him with the blade. That the Luke Skywalker, or the was it Samurai Shodown, where you're hitting A button and both of us are pushing it, right? You're kind of looking over your sword, pushing at each other. The winding essentially removes that as a tactic, or as an
end result,
a stalemate.
Right.
All I have to do is turn my sword from here to there, and wind the back edge over, and I've won. Or I wind as if I'm going to thrust, and then she pushes on the sword, and I cut to the other side. Right? So there's never really a moment where I don't have some sort of sword solution that doesn't require me to wrestle, grapple, or stand there grunting.
Although all of those things are hilarious. So I'm going to do an interkingdom anthropology point.
Okay.
So because we're doing this here for Kaid.
Yeah.
In the after times when we're allowed to travel to other kingdoms, some kingdoms allow pommel hitting, or simulated pommel strikes, or simulated key-on strikes, and what that would look like. And again, you really have to trust the person you're with. So if I'm fighting Lot here in Kaid, and we get into that position, and we get into a position where we're here, and I flip a pommel up, 9 times out of 10, if I get in this position, Lot goes, I'm good.
I'm good.
I don't even have to touch him. I just have my pommel in his face, and he knows that the next thing I'm going to do is knock. and either I'll go, good? Or he'll go, no, I'm good.
Yeah.
Match over.
Yeah.
And I haven't had to hit him. In some kingdoms, what they will do is when you get into this point and you flip the pommel, again, rather than rotating the sword, I'm rotating the pommel. They go tap, tap. And they go tap, tap. It's right here. And the tap, tap, either the words or just a gentle knock to the face mask, is enough to indicate this fight is over. So it really depends on what kingdom you're in. That some of them allow simulated pommel strikes, generally only to the head.
Generally only the face.
Yeah, to the mask area. But there are some kingdoms that are experimenting with grappling.
Mm-hmm.
We are not that kingdom
Yet.
at this moment in time. So eventually, maybe someday, there will be grappling. But the hoops that people will have to go through.
But like I said, there's always a sword solution.
There's always
in
a sword
that moment.
solution.
There are, especially if your opponent also can't grapple.
Right? If both opponents can't grapple.
If both opponents can't grapple, we're not allowed to grapple, then there's a sword solution. If somebody initiates the grapple, then it's probably time for a grappling solution.
Right.
But we're not allowed to do that in general.
Outside of experimental some
right.
kingdoms.
So, but there is a sword solution to the problem.
9 times out of 10.
9 times out of 10, and practicing that winding motion and those short edge cuts
Right.
Can really help.
And again, if you're out of kingdom, in a kingdom that does allow pommel strikes, just ask what the rule set is.
Yep.
It will almost only happen in cut and thrust. Not every kingdom allows it. And sometimes here in Kaid, if the two people trust each other and have sparred with each other before, and somebody gets that move, not actually hitting the person, but gets the pommel within striking range, the other person will take it. Like, yep, I'm good.
I think
no grappling
movie
required.
lightsabers are stickier than even sharp swords.
Maybe.
They get stuck together a little bit more,
I don't know.
and then they have to push.
It's kind of like fighting rattan with duct tape.
on
a hot day, they get
on the
smushed.
wrong side.
Yep, you get stuck. That's why I like hockey tape better.
All right, hopefully
so-
that was a good question.
That's
It's
a great
really
question.
good
Did we give you the
Hopefully that gave you a
answer
good
that's
answer.
helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just really hard to practice those close in back edge cuts on a pal.
Ironically,
Pal doesn't push back.
Right, this is true. So you don't get to necessarily feel that leverage, but I will say that just practicing smoothing out that motion where you can just whoop and keep your hands in the right spot and stay defended as you throw up and down from both sides, kind of this direction and this direction. And I think at the very least, for season 2, maybe we'll put a back edge cutting, a short edge cut lesson together.
I don't know,
That will focus on short
7.
edge cutting and how to practice
Right.
those against Pels, because I think that's really important.
Because that's my life right now, is practicing short
It's a
edge.
lot of our lives right now.
Is practicing, especially short edge cuts.
Short edge cuts.
Because I'm slowly migrating my way through Meyer dusack, and at least 3/4 of the cut are throw the cut, then flip to your or flip to the short edge of the sword and cut with the crooked edge. And you're like, okay, are you going this way? Are you going this way? And just being able to maneuver the sword. And I don't always have a lot to practice against. So I have a Pel. You can see our cutting diagram in the background. Our Pel actually has a cutting diagram on it, so that when I'm cutting and working on those short edge cuts, I'm making sure that the cut is coming from the right line, that the edge is aligned in the correct direction. I have another cutting diagram that we took down for tonight's episode. It gets taped on the window. So I have 3 different paradigms of cutting diagrams that we have back here.
Because angles are important.
And again, with the box defense, understanding where the cuts come from and getting the edge alignment is super important. But Pel work has been my life right now, especially short edge cuts, especially those, flipping from a direct cut into, like the Waker cuts and those kinds of things of flipping into that.
We're also working on experimenting with different spring types or something that can hold like a dowel.
And a dusack.
And a dusack or a longsword or something that you can sort of set up against and then cut into, and it will...
Right, because we have 2 Pels, so we have a straight Pel, and I have one that I'm in the process of deconstructing that we're going to put a monitor arm, like a wall-mounted monitor arm, which has the gas hinges, which allow you to move a monitor, up and down, as well as down and up, and rotates 180 degrees this way. So what I'll be able to do is position an arm, tip it, and then rotate it, so that I could potentially get some of our dusacks and our swords to hang like in bow, or to hang in straight parry, and mimic the location of arms. I'll let people know how that goes.
Yeah, it's an experiment.
It's an experiment, so we'll see what happens. But
yeah, the idea of having something to kind of bind against and strike against and know where that sword is as you're working around it can be pretty tricky.
It's pretty tricky.
Yeah.
That's why I have tape everywhere in our yard. Any other?
Yeah, I mean, it's like for me, it's just hard to be like, okay, at this point, this the motion would be arrested, and this is the point where I've got to flip the sword and come in with the false edge.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of to really understand it. You got to play with it with some contact, but ultimately, if you think about this, that every motion, every cut goes through long point or that extension. So you can't start turning it until after you get here. Because if you start turning it early, you're going to get this blow doesn't do its job of clearing the line. Right? So you have to clear the line, force your opponent to engage, and once you're here, then you can start rotating it to its next spot. Right? So that's how I tend to practice is or you can throw the initial blow as a short edge, but again, you have to kind of step out to do that. So you can throw your first blow and defend against the downward cut, because I'm throwing my long edge up and I'm getting into that box defense. Or I can defend into the diagonal line and then from there throw into the other diagonal line. And it's the same mechanics. They're done in 2 different times from 2 different spaces, and so practicing both of them becomes, okay, I'm cutting into this line and I know I need to defend low, so I have to defend that low line with my box situation, and now what am I going to do next? Well, I'm going to wind a cut over, or the cut's coming high and I'm going to be throwing a winding cut this way in order to catch high and throw a cut behind it, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So now I've got two different cuts with that back edge that are coming in two different actions, or I can throw up from below with that back edge. And again, I end up, which quadrant am I defending? I'm defending this quadrant when I throw that cut. And so I go, okay, well, I'm defending that quadrant, or I can throw up into that quadrant with the long edge and then wind the short edge into my next action. And so I now have, so these are steps I can practice. Even if I'm not getting the physical communication against me, I can practice the different stages I'm going to need for when I do have.
Right.
Because what's going to happen is that physical contact, every time you get it, is going to be different.
Right.
And so there isn't a one true timing on it. It's always going to be different. So being flexible and able to understand throwing from one spot to another spot, then to another spot. Or, okay, now I'm throwing this spot first and then to another spot. And figuring out where those spots go and how to do them sort of infinitely. I mean, my Meyer square series needs to get done. I'm working on that. And that's the Meyer square, which is very similar to the 1,000 blows. It's a 100 blows series, but it's a period structure of how to, structuring, cutting into the 4 openings over and over again in different ways, which allows you to evolve your practice technique and throw multiple different series and sequences of blows in different ways. It's absolutely key to kind of that practice and saying, okay, I can do this blow, and now I can change this blow. And I can go from this blow to this blow to this blow, and now I can throw a short edge version of all those blows, and I can throw a pulling version of all those blows, and I can throw a running off on all those blows, and I can now alternate all of those blows going from one to the next.
But so on a note on solo practice, again, that's been my life. One of the I'm working through dusack, and I'm working on the individual cuts, and I'm using the cutting chart, with the flick. Mm-hmm. So the flick is that we stand in bow, it flicks out.
Yeah, we did the flick tonight. Yeah,
we did the flick tonight. So, but to practice that with the, both the straight out with the short edge and then over the top with the short edge, I will tell you that having practiced those and then getting to do them the first time against Lot, where he's hanging in the bow, and I'm like, all right, so I reach out and I go flick, and I'm like, whoa, wow, that was fast. It was a lot faster, and I'm like, oh, that's how the mechanics work when I actually hit it against your sword. Oh, this is really cool. I can't wait to do this more. But I'm finding that a lot of the mechanics, as I'm smoothing them out and making sure that I'm hitting the line, making sure that my edge is aligned, that when I do get the opportunity to hit a person, either some of the assumptions I've made, I'm like, whoa, why is my head so exposed? Or wow, that's a lot faster. That gets your sword to move so much quicker. And even with some of the binds that we were doing tonight, because I've been working on the short edge, when I actually had the opportunity of just, flipping over and getting into the wind, I'm like, wow, that's really fast. So, the solo practice, especially if you can mark off your pel with the quadrants, or another mechanism for having a cutting diagram, I have found really helpful for understanding I'm defending this line. Am I getting to long point? Am I getting to the center of the fight where I need to be? Then am I flipping? Working on various different timings of things, because everything's a whole lot of it depends. But I know that there's going to be a lot of adjustment when I can actually do it against a real person. And I saw that tonight where I'm like, whoa, that's a thing.
It's good stuff. Solo training's difficult. It is always difficult.
Yeah.
But it's also really important, I think, and one of the reasons why we want people thinking about these things now is that solidifying those mechanics now, so that when you do have pressure, when you do have somebody else working with you, even if it's a drilling circumstance, your mechanics are ready to go, because because mechanics is really important. It allows you to react and respond to your opponent that not necessarily, like, there's a hindbrain situation here that even when you get into a drill situation where it's very safe, very controlled, and you know what's coming, your brain starts to go a mile a minute, and your mechanics just fly out the window. So the more that we can practice these things, become comfortable in that space, and trust our body when it's time to do it, the better and more accurate your training is going to be when you do go back into practicing with partners. So that's a good thing to take home.
Any
Good.
other questions that folks
Other
have?
questions? The
Anything
things we didn't
can-
answer?
Yeah. Cool. Well, it is almost 10:30. So I
Yeah.
think we should,
call
wrap it
it.
up.
Okay.
So what are we doing next week or next time, Lot?
I guess next time, I think what is on the schedule is to examine putting all of this together in some cohesive ways, looking at both the side sword form, the Bolognese side sword form, which really breaks down shoulder cuts and elbow cuts, thrusts and wrist cuts in a structural presentation that says, here's these actions, throw this action, and then do this action, and how it kind of flows together and presents itself, and kind of contrast that with the dusack, which we've been talking a lot about because we love it, but it is really a very fluid form.
Right.
Meyer doesn't talk about wrist cuts or elbow cuts or shoulder cuts at
everything
all.
all
Everything kind of like mishmashes
blends together, and you're expected to know when's when.
And we can kind of build some cohesive examinations of those styles to come up with the core of what we should be thinking about when we tactically apply cuts and thrust against our opponent, and take that into whatever we choose to do. Whatever form we're studying, whatever form we're working with.
Cool.
And how the fundamentals of those kind of apply themselves.
I'm excited.
Hope you
So
are.
hope you guys come back next time. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
It's been great having you.
And we're going to look at systems that involve everything.
Yep.
So,
Well, all systems involve everything, but we'll
Thanks,
look at
guys.
a couple.
all right. Good night.
Have a great rest of your night.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you for joining
Thank you
us.
for joining.